Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my new studio in Florence, Italy, it's very exciting to welcome you in here. And this will be the first sculpting video that we'll be doing together, and hopefully we'll do many more. This first one was not exactly a request, but several people asked for a beginner video, and the original video that I had in mind would have not have been a beginner video. It was a lot more complex, 3/4 life-size seated male figure, which is quite complex. But the concepts that I would have employed would still have been the same, but I decided that it'd be good to start with something simple. I haven't really sculpted anything since last November, which is quite a long time, so I thought it'd be good for me and for you guys to perhaps start off with something quite simple, quite easy. And this is one of the one of the first exercises that the students at Florence Academy do when they start out studying. Well, it's not the first one, but it's one of the earlier ones. And it's to copy a plaster skull in clay. Now we're not exactly copying it because I'm sculpting a 3/4 skull, and the reason I'm doing that is because I want to sculpt something that's a little bit faster. The life-size skull, obviously bigger, takes a longer time, and I also want to cast this thing up in plaster and sell. And I think if it's a slightly smaller thing, shipping is cheaper, material cost is cheaper, and it will still, it'll be a perfectly functioning skull, except it's a little bit small, which is okay. Okay, so the first thing that I start off with is the center line. And I did a quick measurement from the bottom of the chin to the top of the head, just to kind of get myself in the ballpark of 3/4 life size. And then I just kind of mark those two off early in the beginning. I make sure that how big the skull is going to be, and then I kind of work within that. And you see me also stepping back and forth a lot, and that's something that I end up cutting out. So you don't really see that much, but I'm constantly stepping back and forth. I think maybe I cut out half of the time that I spent sculpting this. And it's also sped up, as you can obviously see. I'm not this fast, sadly. So I start off by sculpting the profile. And the profile is essentially the center, if you split your face in half, draw a line straight down the middle of the face, and you look at it from the side, that's the profile. And this is the most recognizable feature on the human face and on the skull. And if you look at a human face from the front, the outline's not very recognizable from person to person. But if you look at him from the profile, that is very, very obvious who it is. Then it becomes very obvious who it is. And it's important whenever you're sculpting, well, not necessarily important, but the way that we teach and the way that I like to sculpt, it is important to kind of start off with something that is a point of reference, something that is a truth that you can hold on to. And in a figure, we use the width of the pelvis from aces to aces, and on the portrait, and even though this is a skull, it's essentially the same thing as a portrait, we use the profile. And so I try to build up as accurate of a profile as I possibly can. And you can see me drawing out the center line right here as well. That is also an important thing to keep on doing. I try to maintain a center line, and I keep redrawing it all the time, because then I build up my profile on that center line, the high points on my profile on that center line, and it'll become easier to work. Once I turn the head around, the skull around, it'll become easier to work right to left, keeping symmetry. So I start off by building the profile. I find all my heights and the depths on that profile line. Then I proceed to some of the features. This is the eye socket, the back of the jaw, these type of landmarks, and I find their heights in relationship to my profile line and the depth. And this is important. They need to have depth. Sculpture is about depth, otherwise we'd essentially be drawing, and we're not. We're trying to make something that's going to be three-dimensional, and one of the major strengths that we have in doing that is creating depth. So I try to make sure that, for example, I notice that where the back of the eye or the back of the eye socket is in relationship to the front of front of the cheekbone, things like this, how far the cheekbone goes back before it reaches its high point, these sorts of things. And then I start working on the other side, and when I do turn it around, it becomes a mix of working from the reference, the skull, but also working from what was established on the other side. It's a bit of a mix of both, because I want to maintain symmetry, which is why you see me constantly coming back to the front, so that I'm not building a skull that's extremely lopsided, and then once I start looking at the front, I'll have to correct that, and that would just be quite annoying, and a lot of extra work that I can actually spare myself. Because I drew that center line down the face so many times in the beginning and made sure that I built up that profile on that center line or that profile and that center line now functions from the side as well, from the other side as well. So I can stand, so when I go back to the other side, the profile that I built up, I know it's center and I can still see it from the other side, meaning that I can use it and employ it, and I can keep on adjusting it, and that's something that I definitely do, you know. That profile is the most important thing, and I'll constantly keep adjusting it. I will try not to progress too far ahead to the point where adjusting the profile becomes too difficult. If I add too much width to this too early on, it does become very, very difficult to adjust that profile. Imagine if I needed to push the lips back in, for example, right now. There would be, or well, maybe not right now, but certainly later on in the project when I built out the width of the mouth, it would be a lot of work to pull all that clay off. But if I keep it quite narrow in the beginning, I can establish my profile, I can establish all the heights of the different features, I can establish symmetry, I can establish all the depths of the different features, and then I can grow those out when I turn the sculpture and start working from the front, which is what you're seeing right here. So I've turned it to the front, I still have that center line, and now I'm working them out both sides, and I'm trying to establish both sides at the same time. I don't want to work one side because copying from right to left can be quite tricky, I find, and it just becomes, I mean, this method is already quite mechanical, and I don't want to make it too mechanical. That would, you know, kind of, I don't know, it's not that interesting to sculpt in that fashion. You know, you sculpt one side and then you measure everything from one side and put it on the other side. And also I find measuring usually throws me off. Like, measuring too much never gets me the result that I want. In building up these widths, I'm trying to make sure that the relationship between the different areas are correct. So for example, the relationship between jaw and cheekbone, I try to maintain that as I slowly build up both. And the same goes for the skull. I try to maintain all these relationships so that nothing gets too far out of whack, which would make it quite difficult. It's important to keep it visually clear, I think. And yes, that's what I'm trying to say here. It's important to keep things visually clear. And so if I built out the skull 100% and kept everything, you know, the cheekbones and the jaw very narrow, then all of a sudden what I am working on, the sculpture that I'm working on, does not resemble the reference material, the reference plaster skull at all. And I think it's important that you try, even though it's not going to look a lot like that in the beginning, it's important to try your best to keep always moving in that direction, so you're not departing too far away from your reference material. The closer you are in relation to your reference material, the more obvious your mistakes are going to become. And you can use that to your advantage. Of course, this does not mean that right now, for example, I want to rake my entire surface down and make it really smooth, because then all the mistakes would be very obvious, of course, but it's important to maintain a certain amount of process here and go slow and build this up slowly. You can also see most of the work is being done with my hands. There's a few rake tools and maybe a wooden spatula tool that I use every now and then, but most of the work is with my hands. And it's just easier that way, it's faster. As long as I'm not trying to get into some depth or crevice, I can easily do all the work with my hands. And I also, you can especially see this on the chin, I apply the clay, and also around the mouth area, I apply the clay in the direction of the form, and this kind of helps, again, it helps it, even though it's not smooth and it's just blobs of clay really, it helps it flow nicely together, and it kind of starts resembling a finished product. Well, it's not a finished product of course, but it starts resembling what I'm actually looking at, and it starts kind of giving me an idea of where I'm going, and I always find that this helps quite a lot. You don't want to stray too far away from your reference material, essentially. You don't want the sculpture to look too different. So as I'm sure you've noticed, this is sped up footage, and because it's sped up because the process is so long, you know, this video before I edited it down was probably, you know, 2-3 hours long maybe. This is about 2-3 hours of sculpting probably, and it's edited down. I edited out all my stepping back and forth, and I sped it up, and so it becomes impossible for me to talk about every single piece of clay I'm putting down, of course, because I'm putting them down fairly fast in this video. And this is also in post, so I can't really remember what my thoughts were with every single piece of clay. But I think it's less important to talk about that, and more important to talk about overall concepts and the processes that I employ and that we teach while I'm sculpting. These are the type of things I believe that you can take, and you can employ and use in your own work, because you're never gonna have the same questions. Well, you are to a certain extent, but you're never gonna have, you know, you're never gonna be able to put down exactly the same piece of clay that I'm putting down right here and just copy it. And it's more important that you know the concepts and the ideas behind what I'm doing, and then you can take those to your own work, and it becomes a lot more applicable to yourself. The goal is, when you learn sculpture, the goal should be that once you're never done learning, of course, but once you're done in school, you are capable of answering the questions that arises during a project like this yourself. You don't necessarily need somebody to help you answer those questions, and you know what questions to ask. I think that's the most important part, really. If you know what questions to ask, the answers are quite easy to come by, really. And I think that's kind of a thing for beginners, is they don't necessarily know what questions to ask. But when you point that out to them, the answers become very, very obvious right away. So this is kind of how I try to teach at the school as well. Now I haven't taught there a lot yet. I just started, so, you know, but this is kind of what I've been thinking about and what I would like to do as much as possible. Obviously, when you see somebody's work and you try to correct what they're doing, you can you know, point out small mistakes and things like this, but more importantly, talk about the process and what questions they should be asking themselves while they're working. So this skull obviously has teeth, and here you can see me drawing on the surface, and this is quite important, I think. Drawing in space, as Rob Bodum used to call it. Well, he still calls it that. That sounds very ominous. Here's another thing that I do a lot, is that I get up on top of something, like a stool, or I get low by just bending over and looking at the sculpture from above. And when you do that, you can really, really see any asymmetry, and you can quickly fix those. In this case, there weren't that many asymmetries that were too atrocious, so there wasn't too much to fix, which was good. And yes, drawing in space, a Robert Bodum saying for sure, and something that he's been teaching for many years at the Florence Academy of Art. And you saw me do that in the beginning, or right before this. I drew in the teeth where I want the teeth to be, and this kind of becomes, you know, a visual representation. I don't have to sculpt the teeth in necessarily, but now I know where they are. And their center line and a couple of other shapes in the brow and on the chin, kind of drawing them in. But always also reinforcing the drawing with clay. I think that's very important. Some areas, like some detailed areas, you don't necessarily have to do that. like the teeth, for example. I don't have to put small pieces of clay for teeth right now. But as you saw me, for example, draw out that little shape on the chin, it's important to put clay there so that your sculpture again resembles your reference material. And when I do that, I look a lot at light and shadow and try to match those, or at least move it in the right direction, right? It's not going to be a match right away, of course. We're also back to the profile. As I said, the profile is very, very important. And so we're back to it and we're adjusting it. And something that I do once I kind of get it up to this point is that I will take a rake tool and I would kind of clean up my profile a little bit, just to make it a little bit easier to see, a little bit easier to read. Again, bringing it closer to the reference material, but not bringing it so far along that it's gonna be difficult to change. I'm not rendering anything out here, you know. We're just making sure we get some of those bumps out of the profile line. Okay guys, so this video is almost over. If you like what you saw, I hope you click like. I hope you click subscribe. That's the big red button that says subscribe, or subscribe in your language. And down in the description below there'll be links to my Instagram, my Facebook, my website, so you can check all those out if you like. And yeah, there'll be a bunch of parts to this, you know, and very soon we'll start sculpting some bigger things as well. But I think it's good to start off with, for me as well as you, I think, to start off with something like this, something a little simpler, even though a skull is quite complex. So thank you for watching. I hope you like what you saw, and you click like and subscribe. See you in the next one.